A 9-year-old boy with no formal starfighter training flew a Naboo N1 into the belly of a Trade Federation battleship and blew it apart from the inside. That single moment in the Phantom Menace turned the N1 into a legend, and it is also the reason almost everyone misunderstands the ship. For over 25 years, fans have judged the N1 by that miraculous moment, treating it as either a surprisingly capable frontline fighter or a beautiful design held back by strange flaws. It had no conventional landing gear or standard astromech socket, and a tail fin that plugs into the palace walls, so the throne itself can upload mission orders directly into the fighter's computer. None of it makes sense for a typical starfighter, and there is a reason for that, one that changes everything about how this ship was meant to be understood. To piece this together, we dug through both canon and Legends material, from the films and official reference books to the Johnston novels, the Shattered Empire comics, and the designers who shaped the N1 with their own hands. The story starts not with the ship, but with the world that built it. Chapter 1: Built for a Throne. Naboo had no army, and that was not an accident. It was a mid-rim world governed by an elected monarchy, a wealthy and culturally proud society that valued art, education, and environmental care far above military strength. The entire defense structure of the planet, the Royal Naboo Security Forces, served not as a standing military, but as a volunteer security organization. Its members were peacekeepers first and defenders second, all under the command of Captain Quarsh Panaka during the era most central to the N1 story. In Legends continuity, the Spacefighter Corps was formed by King Ars Varuna, Padme Amidala's predecessor, specifically to gain leverage in dealings with the Trade Federation. He did not create the Corps because Naboo faced an immediate danger. He created it because he wanted a stronger hand at the bargaining table, which means the Fighter Corps was a diplomatic tool before it was ever a military one. The N1 was a real starfighter with real firepower, fully capable of protecting Naboo's skies and serving as a mainstay of planetary defense. Official material describes it as formidable in aerial engagement. The difference was never about whether the ship could fight, but about everything else it was designed to do at the same time. It served as a patrol, escort, and local defense craft rather than a mass-produced war machine in later Republic sense. Its role in a fight was real, but royal symbolism, escort duty, and Naboo's design philosophy were just as central to its purpose. Beneath the chrome and the ceremony, Naboo's entire security structure revolved around one idea: protect the monarch at all costs. E.K. Johnston's novel, Queen's Peril, reveals how deep that philosophy ran. One of Padme's first acts as queen was hosting a sector-wide summit to rebuild ties with Naboo's neighbors in the Chomel sector, choosing diplomacy and regional partnership over military buildup. While other worlds in the sector had grown distant during her predecessor's isolationist reign, Padme reached outward. Captain Panaka, obsessive about security, poured all his energy into shielding the queen rather than expanding the armed forces. He revived the ancient handmaiden decoy tradition, hid blaster compartments in the throne itself, and organized his entire detail as a personal barrier around the monarch rather than a fighting force meant for open engagement. Naboo did not have a soldier class. It had a service class shaped by devotion and cleverness rather than brute force. On Naboo, every piece of technology was expected to serve as both art and instrument, and the N1 was no exception. Even the S5 heavy blaster carried by their security officers was an elegant, almost sculptural weapon. That same principle shaped the N1 from nose to tail. More than any technical feature, the chromium tells you who the ship really served. Originally, Naboo's chrome-like finish helped protect ships from harmful upper atmosphere radiation. But as newer shielding technology replaced that need, the chromium stayed and became political. Royal chromium treatment was reserved for the crown. The N1's forward chrome was a visual oath of allegiance, visible to anyone watching the ship pass overhead. The Forces of Destiny animated short, The Starfire Stunt, confirmed the hierarchy on screen. Padme Amidala flies a fully chromed N1, while Ahsoka Tano flies a standard variant with only partial chrome. You could read the politics of Naboo off the hull of its fighters without saying a word. The unarmed J-Type 327 Nubian Royal Starship completed the picture. It carried no weapons at all, relying entirely on powerful shields, while its mirrored hull was polished by skilled artisans and considered a work of art. The vessel that carried the head of state was supposed to represent the civilization itself. The N-1 fighters flying alongside it were the armed half of the equation the Royal Starship deliberately lacked. And together, the unarmed transport and its armed escorts sent a clear signal to anyone watching. Even the engineering choices buried inside the hull reflected Naboo's values. The twin Nubian engines were modified to produce fewer atmospheric emissions, and the N1 carried a hyperdrive that allowed it to accompany Naboo's diplomatic missions as part of the Queen's honor guard. The compressed astromech socket told the same story. The designers chose a shallow, bottom-fed socket that required the droid to squeeze into a tighter space, all because they refused to break the N1's sleek profile for a full-depth droid well. On a pure war machine, that trade-off would be reckless. On a royal escort where visual elegance carried political weight, it was entirely logical. None of these choices would matter until the day Naboo actually had to fight, and that day was coming. Behind the scenes, the ship's creator confirmed every one of these choices. Doug Chiang, who led the art department for The Phantom Menace, revealed across multiple interviews that the N1 was inspired by an Art Nouveau hairpin, a delicate piece with a butterfly shape and a long tapered tail. George Lucas directed Chiang to use Art Nouveau as the defining visual language for Naboo, and the entire prequel design approach followed from that direction. In interviews with CG Channel and Daps Magic, Chiang described how the prequel design philosophy was rooted in a craftsman era where everything was individually made and every vehicle was treated as a piece of art. Naboo's vehicles would look nothing like the worn, industrial machines of the original trilogy. They would look sculpted, intentional, and beautiful. Chiang's design instincts went even deeper than aesthetics. The boat-shaped hull bottom came from the idea that Naboo's abundance of water meant the ships should feel aquatic. The original concept imagined the N1 landing on water, which is why it has no conventional landing gear. The designers were thinking of something closer to a Venetian vessel docked in the marble arches of a grand structure, not a rugged military machine meant for rough terrain. Compare that to a ship actually made for open warfare. The ARC-170, the heavy fighter that clone pilots flew during the Clone Wars, was also built by a democracy, but the Republic was fighting for survival against an existential military threat. The ARC-170 carried dedicated gunners, a full-depth astromech socket, rugged landing gear, and a pressurized cockpit rated for deep strikes behind enemy lines. It was designed to be stamped out by the thousands and replaced without hesitation when lost. Naboo and the Republic were both democracies, but they faced completely different kinds of danger. The Republic treated its ships as ammunition. Naboo treated them as heirlooms, each one individually tuned for a small fleet on a world that valued craftsmanship over mass production, and the care that went into each vessel reflected that pride. The N1 only fully makes sense inside the system that built and supported it. Chapter 2. The Palace completes the ship. Without the Theod Royal Palace, the N1 was only half a machine. The ship was engineered as one component of a larger system that included specialized hangars, charging ports, overhead cranes, and a dedicated engineering core. Much of the ship's operational logic sat not inside the cockpit, but inside the walls of the royal complex itself. The Theod hangars served as headquarters for both the security forces and the Starfighter Corps, housing the full N1 fleet alongside the Monarch's royal starships. A secret underground tunnel connected the hangar directly to the throne room, allowing the royal household to reach its fighters without ever stepping inside. The interior featured a massive bay with a curved ceiling and a polished floor fitted with electrostatic grates designed to keep the air clean. Because even the military hangar had to reflect Naboo's environmental standards, it was more than a docking bay. It was the nerve center of everything Naboo had for self-defense. What most people miss is what was hidden in the walls. The N1 central trailing fin, the long extension behind the cockpit that most viewers assume is just a design flourish, was actually a power and data conduit. When docked, that fin plugged directly into ports built into the hangar walls, and two critical things happened through that single connection. First, large transformers delivered a high-voltage power charge to activate the fighter's systems, topping off its energy reserves and bringing all systems to full readiness. Second, the tactical computer fed coded mission coordinates and strategic plans directly into the fighter's onboard computer and autopilot. The ship did not just receive power from the royal complex, It received its orders, navigation data, tactical objectives, the entire mission plan, all downloaded through a physical link to the seat of royal authority. No other starfighter in the galaxy operated this way. The astromech loading process told the same story. Because of the compressed socket, getting a droid in and out of the N1 required specialized ground equipment, including overhead cranes, mechanical arms, or repulsor lifts. A main index below the main flight level included a dedicated area where astromech droids were prepped before each mission. Every launch started inside the hangar, and every return was supposed to end there. Even the fleet's small size fit the philosophy perfectly. A single Venator-class Star Destroyer during the Clone Wars carried over 400 fighters. Naboo's entire fleet would barely register on a Republic Navy inventory sheet, but for a volunteer planetary defense force on a peaceful world, a small fleet was the right number. It was enough to fly patrols, escort the Queen, respond to piracy, and project a visible security presence without crossing into the kind of open buildup that would have alarmed Naboo's own citizens. The small fleet also meant each ship could be treated like a custom piece, with individually tuned engines and carefully polished chromium surfaces. A fleet of 10,000 demands a factory. A small fleet like Naboo's demands a gallery. Strategically, this is exactly why retaking the Theod hangar mattered so much in The Phantom Menace. The hangar concentrated Naboo's access to starfighters, infrastructure, and escape routes in one place. It sat next to the generator complex that powered the fleet, connected to the throne room by hidden tunnels, and contained the tactical computers and every fighter Naboo had. Even long-distance travel depended on this infrastructure. The N1's hyperdrive handled local patrol and sector travel easily, but for longer diplomatic voyages, the escort fighters could dock with the J-type diplomatic barge and refuel in transit. One more piece of a convoy rather than a lone operator. Recapturing the hangar meant reclaiming command, control, energy, and military force in a single stroke. The heavy blast door at the rear opened directly into the generator room and the plasma refinery complex, the same connected space where Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi fought the Sith Lord Maul. The hangar, the generators, and the royal complex were all one continuous system. Then came a fight nobody planned for, and overnight, the N1 became something its designers never imagined. Chapter 3: The Impossible Launch. The N1 had no proven record and no reputation beyond its beauty when Bravo Squadron launched that day. The pilots who flew it were handpicked volunteers, brave and skilled, but few had any real experience in a shooting fight. Their rigorous training had prepared them for patrol encounters and escort formations, not for a direct assault on an orbital battleship. Their commander, Rick Ollier, also served as the personal pilot for the Queen's Royal Starship. A well-funded military would never combine those two roles into one officer. Rick Ollier's dual role tells you just how thin Naboo's starfighter establishment really was. The mission they launched was, by any honest measure, an act of desperation. Queen Amidala's plan required the Gungan Grand Army to draw the droid forces out of Theod, buying time for her strike team to retake the hangar. Once the hangar was secure, Bravo Squadron could launch. A handful of light patrol fighters, crewed by volunteers, rising from a bay they had recaptured minutes earlier, flying straight at a Lucrehulk-class battleship in orbit. Their target was the ship's receiver array, the signal keeping every battle droid on the surface operational. The Lucrehulk was one of the most heavily armed vessels in the galaxy, bristling with turbo lasers and shielded by squadrons of droid fighters. Bravo Squadron had no assault craft, no capital ship support, and no fleet behind them. This was a conquered people throwing everything they had at an enemy they could not overcome, and they launched anyway because there was nothing else left to try. What happened next was something closer to a miracle than a tactical victory. Young Anakin Skywalker, a 9-year-old with no formal pilot training but reflexes sharpened by years of high-speed pod racing, had climbed into an N1 during the chaos of the hangar fight. The ship's autopilot launched him into the fray, and amid the swarm of droid fighters, the boy somehow flew directly into the droid control ship's main hangar bay. His torpedoes hit the reactor, and the chain reaction tore the massive battleship apart from the inside. Every battle droid on the surface dropped lifeless to the ground. The occupation ended in a single, impossible moment. The trained pilots of Bravo Squadron held the line against overwhelming odds and bought time they did not know they needed. Their courage and discipline kept the fight alive long enough for that impossible moment to happen. But courage and one miracle do not turn a royal escort into a purpose-built war machine. The victory at Naboo made the N1 famous across the galaxy. It did not change what the ship actually was. Still, the galaxy did not care about that distinction. The story that spread was simple and powerful. The Naboo Starfighter brought down the Trade Federation flagship. A small, beautiful ship from a peaceful world toppled a giant. The reference book Battles That Changed the Galaxy includes this engagement among its entries, and its real significance was political, not military. It proved that the Republic's peacekeeping framework had failed, that a sovereign member world could be overrun by a private corporate army with almost no response from the galactic government. The N1 rode that wave from local patrol craft to galactic legend, not because of what it proved about Starfighter engineering, but because of what the outcome proved about the Republic's failure to protect its own worlds. In the years that followed, far from the legend, the ship quietly went back to its original role. In Attack of the Clones, 3 N1 fighters escort Senator Amidala's diplomatic barge to Coruscant for a critical Senate vote on the Military Creation Act. One is lost to a saboteur's strike on the landing platform. Naboo kept using the N1 the same way it always had, escorting the people who mattered most, guarding them with chrome-plated fighters built for loyalty rather than conquest. Fame does not shield a ship from what comes next. Chapter 4: 20 Years in Darkness. The Clone Wars dismantled the world the N1 was made for, and they did it fast. When the Republic militarized, Venator-class Star Destroyers carried hundreds of mass-produced fighters into engagements across the galaxy. Ships like the ARC-170 rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. During the Clone Wars episode set on Naboo, the N1 still flew patrol and local defense, but the real fighting was handled by clone units and Jedi. When threats like the Blue Shadow virus put the planet in danger, it was Anakin Skywalker and clone troopers who neutralized the crisis, while Naboo's own fighters held their patrol routes overhead. Naboo contributed its senator, Padme Amidala, and its political influence to the war effort, not its ceremonial starfighters. The galaxy had moved into an era of industrial-scale warfare, and there was no place in that kind of conflict for a chrome-plated escort fighter that needed a throne room to receive its mission orders. By the time the war ended, the world the N1 belonged to had already ceased to exist. When Imperial rule took hold, the silence got worse. The Shattered Empire comic series reveals that the regime had demilitarized Naboo years earlier, leaving the planet without active starfighters or trained pilots. For more than 20 years, the N1 sat behind locked blast doors in darkness, stored inside the royal complex like artifacts in a tomb. The volunteer pilots who had once flown them grew old and scattered. Men and women who had considered it the highest honor of their lives to serve the crown spent their remaining years grounded, knowing their ships were gathering dust behind doors they could not open. The chromium on the forward hull slowly tarnished. The power connections that had once fed high-voltage charges and coded mission data into every fighter went silent. The engineering core that had tuned the engines and polished the chrome was gone. The galaxy moved on. Naboo's fleet did not. Then, weeks after the fall of the second Death Star, the locked doors opened for the first time in over 2 decades. Princess Leia Organa and rebel pilot Shara Bey, the mother of future Resistance pilot Poe Dameron, traveled to Naboo on a diplomatic mission to secure the planet's support for the new government. They met Queen Sosha Saruna in the Theed Royal Palace. Before their work could begin, the Imperial remnant struck, carrying out the late Emperor's posthumous orders through Operation Cinder. A Star Destroyer called the Torment deployed satellite arrays designed to tear apart Naboo's weather and render the planet uninhabitable. Palpatine had ordered the complete ruin of his own home world. Naboo's security chief delivered grim news. The planet had no starfighters and no pilots, but Queen Saruna knew about the closed hangar wing. She used her royal authority to open it, and as Leia stepped inside the long, dark bay, she felt a cold chill run through her. A force vision of Maul, a shadow still lingering in the walls of the connected generator complex where he had fallen decades earlier. The same wall still carried the memory of what had happened there. Shara Bey moved through the rows of mothball fighters, checking each one for signs of life in their long dormant systems. She found a handful that could still fly. With no other options, Leia, Bey, and Queen Saruna climbed into the ancient N1s and launched into orbit against the Imperial satellite array. Bay engaged TIE fighters pouring from the Star Destroyer, while Leia and Saruna targeted the satellites. They were outgunned and nearly overwhelmed before the Alliance fleet led by Lando Calrissian aboard the cruiser Restoration arrived and finished the fight. 20 years in storage, and the ship still flew. But they needed a fleet behind them to survive, just as they had always needed a home beneath them. The N1 outlasted the regime and flew one final time to save the planet it was born to protect, but its strangest chapter was still ahead. Chapter 5: A Relic Worth Choosing. 4 decades after its prime, the N1 had become something no one predicted, a collector's item. When mechanic Pelimato presented Din Djarin with a derelict N1 in her Mos Eisley hangar, she pitched it the way a vintage dealer would pitch a rare find, emphasizing its handmade construction, its royal commission, its direct connection to the Queen of Naboo. She was selling history and craftsmanship, not firepower. By Din Djarin's era, the N1 was no longer just a fighter. It was an antique from a lost political world, a relic of a time before the Empire, when volunteer defenders and chrome-plated fighters protected an elected queen, and every ship was treated as a work of art. All of that was gone, except for the ships themselves. What Mato and Djarin did next proved the original N1 could not survive outside its world without being fundamentally changed. They stripped the fighter down to its bare frame and rebuilt it with salvaged parts, swapping out the laser cannons for larger models and mounting a new sublight engine in the center of the body, an addition the original Naboo engineers would never have tolerated. The royal power systems were replaced by improvised charging methods, and the sleek profile those engineers spent years perfecting was gutted to fit raw performance. Doug Chiang, who helped design the rebuilt version for the show, framed it perfectly in an IndieWire interview. In the prequel era, the N1 was like a car from the 1920s, when everything was still individually made. By the time Djarin got his hands on one, it was a vintage car being hot-rodded in a junkyard. And yet, the choice of ship mattered more than the modifications. Din Djarin was a Mandalorian, raised in a culture that valued Beskar armor, heavy firepower, and readiness above almost everything. He could have chosen any ship in the galaxy, from a gunship to a freighter to a purpose-built assault craft. Instead, he chose a ceremonial escort fighter from a pacifist world, a ship without a fleet, built for a queen who was long gone, powered by a home that no longer existed. The N1 needed a home to be whole, and Djarin no longer had one of his own either. He had lost the covert that raised him, the ship that carried him, and the certainty of the creed he once followed without question. George Lucas had always insisted that designers ground their work in history, and this rebuilt N1 was living proof of how deeply the original was tied to a specific time, a specific place, and a political order that had been swept away. When Djarin punched the throttle over Beggar's Canyon, that high whine from the twin Nubian engines was the sound of a lost world still refusing to disappear. After the run, he called the flight Wizard, the same word a 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker used to use on Tatooine a lifetime ago. 2 pilots from 2 different eras, both strapped into the same ship, both finding something in it they did not expect. Plenty of ships were better at winning fights, but very few carried their world's identity as completely as the N1. Every other starfighter in the galaxy was built to answer one problem: how to win in a fight. The N1 was built to answer something else entirely. Naboo wanted to know what their sovereignty looked like catching sunlight over the plains of Theed, and they poured that answer into chrome plating, individually tuned engines, a throne-linked power system, and a hull shaped like a boat because the designers imagined it gliding across water. Every choice that confused the rest of the galaxy, the compressed droid socket, the missing landing gear, the total reliance on royal infrastructure, was the right answer to a question only Naboo was asking. The ship was never flawed, it was never confused. It knew exactly what it was, and that may be the most important thing the N1 teaches about design itself. Every time the galaxy measured the ship by standards it was never trying to meet, the real failure was in the measuring. That was always the N1's answer, from Bravo Squadron's desperate launch over Theed to Shara Bay climbing into a mothball fighter 2 decades later. And at the very end, when Lando Calrissian called on the galaxy to rise, an N1 was among the 14,000 civilian ships that answered. The same ship from the Battle of Naboo, flown by an unnamed volunteer, was present at the final battle of the Skywalker saga. Still, Long after the royal complex went dark and the volunteer pilots scattered, people across the galaxy are still restoring it, still modifying it, still choosing to fly it into fights it was never made for, doing exactly what Pelimato did in that Mos Eisley hangar. Naboo built more than a fighter. They built something worth bringing back. The N1 was a ship built around a home, but not every ship needs a palace. Some of the most remarkable vessels in the galaxy were designed to be the home themselves, and the best of them turned a cockpit into a life worth living. And for those pilots brave enough to leave the galaxy behind entirely, the journey beyond the Outer Rim carried dangers that no ship, no matter how well built, was ever meant to survive.